I'm Sarah, I'm your BCBA, and this is the channel, Yourabahelp. Welcome to my video. I'm so excited to have you here. Today we're going to be talking about measurement, task list C, measurement. We're going to talk about all the different ways you can measure behavior, how to, when to, where do you start, what do you do, how do you be a BCBA in this aspect. That's what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to give you all the terms, all the definitions. This one will be a two-parter. So we'll start part one, will be the intro to all the definitions, and we'll just work our way through it all. Part two will be a little bit more of the information and discussion on how do we apply this and tying it all in together. Cool. So if you're into that kind of content, make sure you give it a thumbs up, you subscribe, give me some comments, let me know what you guys are thinking. When we're talking measurement, this is where we start putting that data and the numbers on behavior. When we talk behavior, we're talking behaviors for decrease and increase. So skill acquisition, teaching those new skills to a person, we need to take data on it. So that way we know our intervention is effective. And then same thing for behaviors for decrease. So those disruptive behaviors and sometimes called problem behaviors. We know our BIP, our intervention, our behavior plan is working to decrease those behaviors. What we're doing is effective, and we know from our attitudes of science, we know from our dimensions of ABA that is important. We need our data, we need to be scientific, we need to have methodologies, we need to have clear steps and systems in order to accomplish that meaningful change. That's why data is so incredibly important. That's what really sets ABA apart from other fields and gives it a very respectable nature in the sense of we do have research and science to prove what we're doing. And when we're going out in the field, we're working with parents, it's the same thing. We do have the research to show and the data to show, look, what we're doing with your sweet child is working. Here's what we're doing, how we're doing it. Here's what you can do. Measurement is incredibly important. Measurement is something that I take very serious, getting accurate data. Getting accurate data and staying true to that side of ABA is incredibly important to me. So then where do you start? Okay, I'm a new BCBA, I just walked out into the field, I have my first client, my first caseload. Where do I start with measuring? How do I decide what to measure, when to measure? We're going to talk a lot more about what behaviors are and how to pick behaviors when we talk about in a couple podcasts where you see the behavior needs change, you understand that, okay, we can't be doing that behavior and you want to change it. You've got that down. We'll talk about that later and how to exactly do that. Let's say you've got that. All right, how do you measure it? When we're talking about measuring, the steps to measurement and deciding how to start, the first one is identifying the behavior. Second one is operationally defining the behavior. We know that operationally defining a behavior is putting it in very clear topography terms. When we're talking operational, we're both agreeing there's a lot of different operational definitions out there, and there's not any standards to it. It's all dependent on the situation in the case, the antecedents and the topography, that behavior. There can be a lot of different factors into an operational definition. The biggest thing to know about it is that there's no feelings, so that they felt sad, so they did this, cannot be part of your definition, and there's no disagreement between parties. So if you agree with me and I agree that that is that behavior and we can both see it and take data accurately together, that's the whole point of the operational definition. We are both observing the same thing. This is the one that we're really going to talk about today, and that is selecting an appropriate observation and data collection method. We will learn about all the different data collection methods. How do you choose them? When we're putting data on these behaviors, we're giving it dimensional qualities. We're giving it base, foundation. We're making it digestible. We're giving it value. So when we talk dimensional qualities, we're adding numbers and data and information to that behavior. We've got our dimensional qualities of the behavior, and when we're looking at dimensional qualities, we're talking about the repeatability, the countability, those are AKAs. The countability is an easy way to remember it in the sense of repeatability, we're just counting the behaviors, the repetition of the behavior. Repeating, we're counting those. The definition, repeatability is instances of behaviors over time frequency, rate, etc., that have a clear start and end. When we're looking at what is repeatability for the dimensional qualities, we are looking at the behavior. Is this a behavior that has a clear start and end? Can we very clearly tell with their operational definition that they are doing this and they're not doing this in each different moments in time? If that behavior is turning on and off, it's got repeatability. It's got that dimensional quality. Some examples of behavior that has repeatability would be clapping your hands. You know when I'm clapping my hands versus when I'm not clapping my hands. It could be wiping your nose. So if you have a tissue and you wipe your nose, and you put the tissue down, that's a very clear start and end. You can tell the behavior has started and ended. It's clear. And it can be for behaviors for decrease. So we're talking about a kid kicking the wall. You could count each kick to the wall or each episode of kicking. So you can tell very clearly that they are kicking the wall now, and then now they're no longer kicking the wall. Measuring, measuring, measuring. Next term to know for dimensional qualities, does that behavior have temporal extent? I'm going to give you the definition of temporal extent. Behavior occurs over time, duration, the extent of the behavior. So what to know about temporal extent is we're measuring the behavior occurring over time. When you're looking at your dimensional qualities of these behaviors, do you need to know the duration of the behavior? Do you need to understand how long this behavior is happening, or do you need to know how many times it's happening? And sometimes it could be both, and that's okay. But when you're looking at it, you're like, okay, I am trying to understand how to decrease this behavior. And you're thinking, well, what am I going to do to measure it in order to see that when I put my intervention in? What you're going to want to think about is, how is this behavior disrupting the person's day? Is it disrupting it because it's so long and we can't get anything else done? Or is it disrupting it because it's happening so often that we need to decrease that in order to have a more productive day or a productive life, whatever it might be? When you're looking at that, are we wanting that time to decrease? So I'm going to compare it to the previous examples. When we're talking about wiping our nose, if a kid is taking like 5 minutes to like wipe their nose, or just sitting there wiping it, it's just, when we're talking about like wiping their nose, if they're just sitting there wiping their nose over and over and over and over, it starts to get to an inappropriate level where they're just, making their nose raw, or it's just taking way too long. That might be something where counting it wouldn't make sense, but maybe you need duration because you need that time of wiping nose to go down, because one instance is still one instance, whether it happens for 5 minutes or 2 minutes. So you gotta look at your data and figure out what you're wanting to decrease. What's the problem here? What's the issue? Whereas if he was wiping his nose all day long, like every 2 minutes, he was just wiping his nose. He was getting up from his seat, walking across the classroom, wiping his nose, throwing tissue away. 2 minutes later, he's back up. You might want to work on decreasing the amount that's occurring. That's why you would pick that data collection. Kicking the wall. If they're doing a few kicks to the wall and then they're done, that might not be the problem. But if they're doing it, every 5 minutes they're kicking the wall, then they're kicking the wall again, and then they're kicking the wall, they come back and kicking the wall. That might be where tallying or counting would be useful. Duration might be where they're like on the ground kicking the wall over and over and over for 10 minutes straight. That might be a goal, to decrease that duration so it's not occurring as often, it's not as disruptive to their day. The little trick that I have for remembering what temporal extent is versus temporal locus that we're going to talk about in a moment. Temporal extent, I say to myself, the extent of the behavior. So what is the extent of the behavior, the time of the behavior? So when you look at temporal extent, I'm going to put a little visual on the screen here of what I'm talking about. But think about it, the EX of extent is going to be your exact. EX, exact. EX, extent. So temporal extent, temporal exact. T for temporal is going to be T for time. So you think about exact time, extent, temporal. I hope I explained that okay. It's just a little way to use the letters of temporal extent to give yourself those little cues in your brain. Okay, temporal extent, exact time, got it, duration, I know this one. Rather than trying to memorize and do cards and like flashcards and all of that, you have this little trick instead. Next up is temporal locus. This one is where every instance of the behavior occurs in relation to other events. We're talking latency, we're talking IRT. For this one, you're going to be wanting to think about what other event is triggering this event that I want to decrease, or maybe there's gaps in time that you want to decrease. There's too much time is occurring in between, demands, things like that. This one is going to be very situational. It's going to be, you're looking at it and you're like, this isn't working for me. Something helpful for me when I'm working with my little ones is I always think about, in the classroom, would this behavior fly? Would they be able to do this? Are they able to go up and wipe their nose 20 times in the classroom? Probably not. Are they able to take 5 minutes to sharpen their pencil from when the teacher said, hey Johnny, go sharpen your pencil, and it takes them, to get from A to B 5 minutes? That's maybe a problem. We need to get more motivation in there maybe, or increase some skills to get them to sharpen that pencil quicker. They've got to be able to keep up with the class, and they have to be able to have a productive day. When we're looking at those instances and you're looking at the behaviors or skill acquisition that needs to be introduced and thinking about, okay, their response time is really low. It's important to not be pushing children too hard or expecting too much of them. If they take a few extra seconds to respond, that's okay. But when we're looking at behaviors that are taking long times over the day, a good classic example, a real life example here, is when mom's telling the kid in the morning to get dressed and they're taking 30 minutes to get their pants on. That's not going to work. You've got to get dressed when we need to get dressed. We cannot be taking our sweet time, and that's where we have IRT or latency coming in and helping us out to measure that behavior. So we put an intervention in and decrease that time, or potentially increase that time. Maybe the child needs to be spending more time in between behaviors. Maybe we want to work on teaching them how to think through things rather than just reacting. Maybe in a social situation they instantly respond, or they cut people off when they're talking, and we want to teach them how to not do that. We want to teach them how to pause, so we don't need to increase that time in between things they're saying. Or if they're a rambler and they talk really fast, they don't have any pauses in their sentence, we might want to put IRT in order to create pauses between those behaviors. I have 2 tricks for remembering temporal locus. So temporal locus, I say in my head locus, I low-key, locus, low-key, got it? I low-key don't understand this, because latency and IRT are the hardest ones. So that was my little trigger in my brain when I was doing my exam to remember what temporal locus is. Low-key don't remember, or low-key don't understand locus, IRT. The other way you can do it is locus is an L and latency is an L. So if you remember those two, you can just remember that latency goes with IRT. Usually those are kind of paired up, so they're similar concept. And then also make sure you're using your keywords that we've learned in the past. We know that temporal means time. So we know that these two, temporal extent and temporal locus, are going to have to do with measuring time. Whereas repeatability, that's not temporal. It doesn't say that. We know it's not about time. So repeatability, we know is going to be those instances where temporal locus and temporal extent, time. When we're talking about repeatability, we're talking about count, rate, and acceleration. Repeatability, remember, is that instance of behavior over and over and over and over. We're measuring each instance. Also, I'm going to say this one more time just so I'm not having to say it throughout. Remember, when we're talking behaviors, we're not just talking behaviors for decrease. It could also be behaviors for increase. We could be measuring that behavior occurring just one time, and that could be the greatest thing ever. It could be the child's first word, things like that. Count is the simplest form of measurement. It is just tallying each occurrence. If you were tracking my talking, you would be tallying each time I say a word. Count. If you guys have been in the field for a minute, you should be fairly familiar with this one. This one is also referred to as frequency, count, tallies, all the same thing. Those are all AKAs for each other. The biggest thing, remember, when you're trying to decide, should I be using count for this behavior? Is it realistic? Is it realistic for that therapist or yourself to tally each instance? We were talking about measuring my talking, and I was talking in a 40-minute seminar. Would you be able to tally each tally accurately over time? Is that something that that person would be able to do? We're talking hundreds of tallies. Maybe, maybe not. That's where you've got to decide to make those decisions. And remember, if you select a data system and you're like, actually, this isn't working, or the behavior increased and you're like, whoa, this has got to change, we're not getting accurate anymore, it's okay to change that. It's not illegal to do that. Nobody's gonna come knocking down your door, I promise. You can change it and be like, actually, we need a more accurate system, and then you can always come back to that other data collection method once the behavior goes back down. You could do both and try to track both and see. All those science part of our field are there for you guys to use. Next one is, how are they going to do it? How are they going to tally these? Are they going to use a clicker? Are they going to use paper? Are they going to use electronic data? Is that, realistic the way that they're going to do it? Are they going to do it for their entire session? Are they just going to do it for 5 minutes to get like a little time sample? Are they going to do it just when those big behaviors occur, or is it for every single instance? Then that's where that operational definition being nice and solid is going to be really important. So that tells the therapist or yourself when to be tracking this and how to be tracking it. And this is the hardest one that I find to make sure you don't mess up on is it giving you the correct information? And that's what I was talking about earlier, making sure what you're measuring is what you're actually wanting to change. Your data has to reflect your intervention. So if you're wanting the amount of times that a kid does something, but you're measuring the duration, those aren't going to make sense. Your data's not going to reflect your intervention. This one, you might make a few mistakes along the way, and that's okay. Once you catch it, flip that data system and make sure you're tracking it accurately. Next up, we've got rate. So rate is the count frequency over another unit. It could be time, like minutes, hours, seconds, it depends. There's a lot of different ways you could do rates. You could do rates per day, rates per hour, you could do rate per occurrence. There's different ways you could do it, and you would have to kind of look at your situation to see which one you'd want to start with. Biggest thing is it realistic? When you're using rate, does it make sense? A big thing that I want you to consider when you're thinking about rate. So if you were measuring a child's requesting for food behavior and they only eat one meal at the end of the day with you, and that rate is 0, 0, 0, 1, 2, 50. Is that rate data helpful for you? It might be, it might not be. Making sure when you're looking at rate, it's a behavior that occurs throughout the day, because you want to know how often is this occurring every hour, for example. They have to have the opportunity to engage in that behavior every hour in order to say rate is going to be helpful, because if you're increasing or decreasing that rate, you need data over time. And that's where maybe choosing rate per minute. So if we wanted to, target that kid's excessive requesting or mandating for meals in your lunchtime, like they're just like, I want to eat, I want to eat, I want to eat, I want to eat. Maybe that's where rate per minute might be helpful. So you're telling each time the kid says, I want to eat, and then you're dividing that over each minute. And you can kind of look at your data and put an intervention in there. Rate is one that's going to take some practice. It's very situational. It's one that I don't use often. I find there's not very many behaviors that occur at a steady rate throughout the day. Usually you see spikes and then decreases, spikes and decreases. Also, what I was hitting on with rate, and the Cooper way of saying what I was saying is rate is best for free operant behaviors. So behaviors that are occurring throughout the day without any clear SD or antecedent triggering them. And this is kind of what I was saying, where we need to pick behaviors that aren't just specific to one exact situation. So rate is typically used for those free operant behaviors that are occurring spontaneously. Next up is acceleration. So we're talking acceleration charts. Charting is another thing it's called. Acceleration is either very popular with what you're doing at your company, or it's unheard of. I find that a BCBA either loves it or doesn't use it, and they're not a fan of it. It all just kind of depends. I've heard great things about acceleration. I've explored it myself. It's not something I've dove into. Kind of my current company that I work with doesn't have quite the setup for acceleration. We use a lot more just traditional data and charts. It's something that I would love to explore more in the future. It has a very strong research backing. But for the purpose of this exam, Acceleration, you just need to know what it is and when to use it and not to use it. Acceleration isn't something that you need to learn how to chart. I would familiarize yourself with the chart so you can kind of see that increase and the decrease on the charts and just kind of understand and look over them. We won't go too far into it. I really don't think you need to know too much. Cooper doesn't give a whole bunch of information on acceleration, so I wouldn't go beyond what Cooper is requiring of you. Acceleration is measuring the rates of responding and how it changes over time for increasing or decreasing. Cooper has a really great table that talks about the limitations of each of these measurement procedures. I definitely recommend using this in your studying if you want a good, concise tool that has all the information in one spot. Cooper is fantastic. I'll put it on the screen if you're watching on YouTube as well. Up next, we've got temporal extent. So we know temporal extent is exact time, the extent of the behavior. We know it is duration. Perfect. Duration is the amount of time that the behavior occurs. It's like I said, if you've been in the field for a minute, you'll probably know what duration is. This is where we're tracking the start and end of behavior. And again, it's got to have a clear start and end so that way you know, and I can agree with you, that behavior has started and that behavior has ended. A good example of one that I'll see sometimes duration will be tracked, but not the best option, is whining and crying. So if you have a kid that's just like whimpering and crying and just pouting, is this still happening? The operational definition better be pretty solid and be able to explain to me that behavior is done when it's done. And that's where it gets tricky when we talk about whining, screaming, crying, shouting, yelling. Those are all very difficult behaviors to tell apart from each other. So if you're going to pick like whining and crying and you want to decrease that duration, make sure when that kid's done crying, they're done and it's clear they're not happy. Like it's very contrasted, or your data is going to be all funky. Because my version of a tantrum is going to be different than your version of a tantrum. Especially depending on the time you're in the field, how much experience you have, how familiar you are with that kid, things like that. For duration, you can measure it per occurrence. So you can measure and chart, each duration that the tantrum occurs throughout the day. Or you can do per session. So in total, over their 2-hour session, their 3-hour session, they cried this much. It depends on what you would find useful. If you have extremely long durations throughout the day, it might be useful to break up each of those durations. It can also be useful to find patterns in your behaviors if you're doing it per occurrence. It might be more realistic if you're looking for a long-term measurement procedure to do per session, because if you're having 20 tantrums throughout the day charted, and then the next day you have another 20, that's 40, and it gets to be a lot. So you have to look at that and kind of consider what would your data look like and what's going to be realistic, what's going to be the most helpful. Sometimes what's the most cumbersome might be the most helpful. Just making sure you have systems to manage that and it's realistic and you're not going to get overwhelmed with what you're doing. And like I said earlier, you can combine count and duration. So, if you need to measure the duration of the kicking on the wall and how many times it's happening, you want to decrease both of those things. That might be something you want to track as well. Just make sure that your RBT or your behavior tech can track the duration, can do the tallies, and can run that behavior intervention plan. You want to make sure it's realistic and that they can do it all. Or you can have another person come in, yourself come in, and help take that data during those intense behaviors if needed. Up next is temporal locus. So we know this one. L is for latency and IRT. Or I low-key don't understand locus and IRT. So temporal locus, you're going to want to pick this one when the behavior is occurring in relation to another event. So you have you're measuring that time between a ST and a behavior, or you're measuring the time in between behaviors. Latency is the one where a behavior is given from another person or a prompt, and how long does it take for the learner, the person that you're taking the data on, to respond. Whereas IRT is the instance in between those behaviors. So we could use IRT to measure our staff's behavior. How much time is between each trial that they're running? Are they taking a 5-minute break every single time they run a trial, or is it a 20-minute break? Measuring that IRT, the two behaviors that you're measuring for IRT have to be the same. There's a visual that I use to help understand latency and IRT when I'm looking at, okay, how do I want to measure this behavior? Which one is it? This visual might be helpful for you. If you're on YouTube, I've on the screen on the podcast, It is basically, it shows the beginning first, like SD in behavior is latency, and then after that it shows how the IRT durations can change throughout the session. I definitely recommend looking it up. I find it very useful. I'm a very visual person, so for me it helped me understand how would this look in session. Those are dimensional qualities that give our behaviors data and foundation and something to work with. Now we're going to go into derivative measures. So we have our dimensional qualities, derivative measures. Derivative measures are going to be more for that skill acquisition, are going to be for measuring, increasing in learning or performance, accuracy, all of those. For derivative measures, we are talking about percentages and trials to criterion. For derivative measures, we have percentage. Percentage is one that's, again, either really popular where you work or not at all. People either use it a lot or not much. It's very popular in the field though to do percentages, percent accuracy. A lot of master criteria is like 80% accuracy over 3 consecutive days. That's a very common, very, very common. So when you're looking at percentages, this is where it gets tricky. You have to have enough data for your percentages to be accurate. And that's what Cooper really harps on in this chapter, is talking about how if you have 3 trials and they get 1 wrong, now they're automatically at 66%. Whereas they only got 1 wrong. Graph that percentage. So if you have 3 trials that you get every day, let's say of hand washing, and they get 2 wrong, now they have a 33%. So you went from a 66 to a 33, they get 1 wrong, now it's all the way down to a 0. And then they get all 3 right the next day, now you're at 100, now you're down at 33 again, 66. See how like when you do percentages with low trial counts, it can be very up and down and very chaotic and hard to pinpoint the actual skill level. And that's when you have to come in, you gotta look at like skill deficits, performance deficits. I'm not saying you shouldn't take percentage data on those behaviors, but really consider how's your data gonna look and is it going to be a true representation of the child's skill. Like one day are they able to wash their hands and the next they're not? Maybe. You're gonna have to figure that out. Percentage is a ratio. You're gonna have to have data over time or opportunities. And that's where, skill acquisition opportunities is very common. So, 5 correct trials over 10 opportunities is gonna give you a 50%. Big downfall percent data can be misleading. So when you see a 50% increase in the behavior, that might only be because they got 1 more trial correct. And that's where you don't see the trial count and percentage data. So you lose a lot of information when you use percentages. You only have the percent, whereas before you had the opportunities and you had the correct trials and you also had the incorrect trials because you could see what the numbers are. Whereas percent, you just have 66, 33, 50 if you just have these numbers, so you lose a lot of information. But it might be worth it for in the name of a easy to read graph, easy accessible information, especially when you're talking about a lot of information. That might be worth it. Percent cannot be used to assess fluency, so you can't say somebody is 10% more fluent in this. And then also percentages can be very misleading. The way that you might report percentages might be different from how I report percentages, because since it's a ratio, there's not really an incorrect way to do it. And that's where like looking at a graph can be misleading. Let me give you this example. So if you did the incorrect responses over opportunities, 2 incorrect responses over 10 opportunities, you said 20%, so they erred 20%. You put that in your graph. That's going to look different than if I went and said, I want to do their correct responses. So for my learner, they got 8 correct out of 10 opportunities. They're going to have 80%. So it's the same behavior, same data. We're reporting it very differently and giving very different outcomes on the observance of that behavior. Things to keep in mind, right? And then also you can give information that's not exactly accurate or it's misleading from that. So I could say that since you had that 20% and I had that 80%, that learner had a 60% increase in their behavior. And that's not true. It's the exact same data. So you can see how that can be misleading when we're looking at, different graphs and we're looking at different BCBAs and how they do things. That's like where the variability in percentage can come. The trials can be iffy. But again, it's a quick, easy way to show a lot of data and information. There's a trade-off. Another thing, you can't report above 100%. That doesn't exist. That's not accurate. You'll see it a lot. Not accurate though. Up next, we got trials to criterion. Trials to criterion is very, very popular in ABA. It's a very common measurement procedure. So first off, what is a trial? A trial, it depends on the behavior, depends on the setting variables, antecedent stimulus, and the desired performance level. So a trial could be literally anything. It could be a clap, it could be somebody looking at you, it could be responding to an antecedent, responding to an SD. A trial is literally whatever you define it to be and what you are wanting to measure. So again, you've got to have a good operational definition, a good clear training and understanding of what behavior you're trying to change in order for everybody to agree that that is a trial. For example, if you are doing a gross motor imitation and you tell them do this and they do it, is that a trial, yes or no? A BCBA might use an entire chain of like hand washing as a trial, or some BCBAs might track each individual step of the chain as a trial. Neither way is correct or incorrect, it's just all how you measure it. And that's why I always talk about consider working at other companies. Everybody does things different ways. Some are better than others, some are wrong, some aren't. I think it's so important to learn different varieties and different options. If you guys want more tips and tricks and tricks, I have a video on it that I just uploaded that I think is so fun. Gives you a lot of the insight in the field that people probably aren't going to tell you, but it's really useful information. Trials to criterion is going to be count data. You're going to be counting each correct trial. You can use other measures for this, but it is far more common to do count. You could use rate, you could use duration, things like that, but those are pretty rare. Trials to criterion is a really popular way to report the cost of the treatment to like families and insurances and to evaluate is this skill worth teaching if it's going to take this many trials. And you can also measure how is that learner doing over time. Are they increasing the rate of learning? Is it decreasing? Are they, starting to, plateau? Is that something that's happening? Trials criterion, every time you put in a one step, are they taking 10 trials to learn that skill, or is it 100? Is it 100 every time, or is it now only 80 trials this time, or only 60, only 30? They're really starting to understand what a one step is. When I say stand up, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I know what to do. And same thing with like imitation. This could be really good to show you like that rate of learning is really starting to pick up, and that's exciting. So that shows you they're understanding what an imitation is. They're starting to generalize that skill across therapists. They're starting to generalize that skill across different SDs or different skills. Super exciting. It's another great way to measure it. It's a way for insurance to measure that. It's a way for insurance to measure the cost of treatment. Is it worth it? Do we need to spend, X amount of dollars in order to get X amount of results? We got definitional measures. This one is going to be, drumroll, this one is going to be topography and magnitude. For this one, we are talking about the form and we're talking about the intensity of behaviors. For this one, we are measuring the response classes, not the specific behavior. So we're measuring a lot of things that look similar or have, a specific magnitude, measuring that. So we could be measuring screaming out in the class using a decibel meter on, the teacher's phone. That could be our magnitude that we're measuring. The point that I'm going to make about magnitude is it could also be used for things like pressure, intensity, sound. There's a lot of different things you could use for magnitude. Just make sure when you measure it, it's not subjective to person. There's a clear one measurement tool like an app on your phone or some sort of visual that you can use to measure that magnitude, because it has to be agreed upon. That's where magnitude can get very tricky. Or we can be measuring the topography and how it changes over time. How somebody's writing slowly gets more clean and, readable could be a topography measure. This one is going to be, again, very situational. So if you're like measuring a kid coloring in the line, that might be a topography measure. You have like a stencil for topography. If you're wanting them to write their name a certain size, they go outside of that stencil. That would be, air for how many times they go out, something like that. This one is something you're really gonna have to carve up, and you would be very specific behavior that you're trying to measure and change. So topography and magnitude might be a good measurement for those particular behaviors. Topography is best used for activities where the skill and the art matter. Think about painting, sculpting, dancing. Alright guys, that is everything for my podcast today. We're finishing up measurement. We're just gonna do 2 parts for task list C. Super great, super easy. I want it to be your all-inclusive, everything you need to know podcast kind of thing. We'll be getting into the rest of it all next week. But I hope you guys have a great week. Bye guys.